All right. Looks like we're going to be live. It's exciting. Another week. We are going to be basically reviewing everything we've done for the last 8 weeks. We're going to be doing, let me just get everything arranged while I'm talking. We're going to be reviewing the end times timeline that we've put together over the last 8 weeks, 16 hours. Hopefully, we can get this down into an hour and really just kind of delve into it, take some questions if anybody is there in chat. Also, just please forgive me. I'm a little sneezy and congested. We have moved one son into college and one that just graduated from college. We moved into his new apartment. And so I've been exposed to a lot of dust this week. That's what I'm attributing it to. It's not that I'm sick. I can't be sick. No. So this should be it'll be interesting. So if I sneeze, I apologize. All right. So where are we? What are we going to be doing? Let's get this stuff rolling. All right, we are going to be doing our overview. And so we are going to basically start from Luke 21 and Matthew 24, and we're gonna plow all the way through Daniel and put together. I've taken all the slides and I've condensed them together so that we're just getting the hopefully the nitty gritty. If you want more in depth of how I came to the decisions, how I made those decisions, please go back and watch them in their entirety. But this is going to be fast paced, and we're just going to go through all of this. So let us start. All right, we are in Luke 21, Mark 13, and Matthew 24. So if you go through and you take a look at all of those scriptures, we came to realize that there were two different events. There were two different conversations that happened. Luke 21 had one conversation that occurred in the temple as they were walking out of the temple. Matthew 24 was called the Olivet Discourse. It happened on the Mount of Olives. They actually happened at two different times. So they're not recording the same event. They're not recording the exact same conversation. They touch on each other, but it's not the same. And if we go to look at it, we look to see that there's some differences within that. And we see that when we look at Luke 21, 12 through 24, we see that they talk about something that sounds like these days of vengeance that Jesus talks about. And he doesn't talk about that in Matthew 24. And we see that there's going to be persecution and Jerusalem will be surrounded and there'll be a desolation. They'll be led captive to all nations. Then he ends it with the Jerusalem will be trampled until the times of the Gentiles are ended. Also, times of the Gentiles are not mentioned in Matthew 24. And so I would say that the time of the Gentiles has basically occurred from 75 AD to 2075, 2000 years, however you want to put it. It's 30 AD to 2030. But basically, it's up until the present time. And during that time, we see false Christs. Jerusalem will be trampled. There'll be deceptions and wars and earthquakes and famine, plagues, signs in heaven, terrors, only the beginning of birth pains. Then the end will come. We see that in Matthew 24:14, that it says, and then the end will come. And it begins with the abomination of desolation. And so we get this end of the Gentile age, and then we get some things that are very similar. There's persecution, there's betrayal, there's sins, there's false prophets. So there's a lot of very similar things, and it's about the abomination of desolation. Now, I'm going to hopefully have a discussion with a gentleman who is a Hebrew scholar, hopefully next week. We'll see how that goes, if I can arrange that, and takes a different position on the abomination of desolation and what happened in 70 AD. And so hopefully we'll have that conversation, and that'll be enlightening to everybody. So this is kind of what we see, this overview of this timeline. And when we do that, we get, this is the important phrase. This important phrase is before all of these things. This phrase occurs in Luke 21. And I just want to show that phrase. Okay. It's in Luke 21:12. And I don't know how you jumped over there. Okay. Luke 21:12, and let's move you there. All right. So you go through this 7 through 11 in Luke 21, and it sounds very similar to language that we see in Matthew 24. There will be earthquakes and famines and plagues in various places. There will be great signs from the heavens. Then we get, but before all these things, before all of what things? Before all the things that we just read, before all of that, that's why we put that into that time of persecution up to 70 AD. They will lay their hands on you, and they will persecute you. And it comes down all the way through here, and it talks about this desolation of Jerusalem. Jerusalem will be surrounded by armies. You know her desolation has come near. Her desolation, its desolation, Jerusalem's desolation, not the abomination of desolation. And then we get, they'll be trampled down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So this was something that was not anticipated by most of the Jewish people during that time. They did not anticipate. Thanks, Kingsley. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. So I'm going to talk to him later this afternoon, and hopefully we'll finalize that for next week, and we'll be able to have that discussion. Jerusalem, though, would be trampled down by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And so that's this time it's fulfilled. And then there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, which then echoes back into Matthew 24. That's when we pick up the abomination of desolation. We pick up those end times conversations. So Luke 21 and Matthew 24 have some of the same things, but they're actually talking about two different desolations. Luke 21 is talking about the desolation of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and Matthew 24 is talking about the abomination of desolation, which is still yet future. So they got skipped over in Luke 21. So this gives us a time frame that we put together, and we put together here. That in 30 to 66 AD, we get the apostles are persecuted in the synagogues by friends, family, and kings. And it's also the days of vengeance. When Jerusalem's surrounded, flee to the mountains. Jerusalem gets desolated. People get dispersed into the nations. The Israelites get dispersed. And then we get the time of the Gentiles, where Jerusalem will be trampled. We get false Christ. We get all these other things that are going on, until we saw the abomination of desolation. And then after, excuse me, some water. A lot more water today. Then we get the abomination of desolation, which after we get persecution again, but that's when you get the sun, moon, and stars that you pick up in Matthew 24, and that you also saw when Luke 21, when it after the time of the Gentiles, it jumped down to there'll be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. Again, if you want more in depth, go back and take a look, or read the scriptures yourself, or just go back and read through that. So this is the overall framework of the timeline that we're dealing with when we look at Luke 21 and Matthew 24. Then what we find in Matthew 24, starting in verse 15, we find that we get this abomination of desolation that will be standing in the holy place. Let the reader understand that spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And that's where we went to next. After that, we'll be going there. But he also tells us that there'll be a great tribulation. But those in Judea will flee to the mountains again, just like they were to flee when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies. When you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, then also flee. But those are two different events: Jerusalem being surrounded by armies and the abomination of desolation. We also saw that this abomination of desolation was reflected in the Antiochus Epiphanes that happened in about 167 AD. And that's different than the abomination or the desolation of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which was reflected in the type of Babylonian desolation. So then we'll get this sun, moon, and star signs. That maybe the sixth seal of Revelation, and we still have to look at that. Then we get the Son of Man will come on the clouds with great power and glory, and there'll be a sign of the Son of Man, and he will gather his elect. Jesus will send out his angels to gather his elect. So this is the overall structure that we're looking for the future, and everything else was before the end. This was in the past or currently happening. So if we're looking for something in the future, what we're looking for, the first thing we're looking for is this abomination. But Jesus told us to go back into Daniel. And we found 4 references in Daniel that talked about what we're supposed to go back and look at. So we get those 4 references, direct reference in Daniel 11:31 and Daniel 12:11. It tells us exactly the abomination of desolation. We get hints of it in Daniel 9:26 and 27, and we get hints of it in Daniel 8:13, where it talks about an abomination that desolates, but not in the exact phrase abomination of desolation. So we go back into Daniel the prophet. And so this is kind of talking about this idea of the scattering, that in the past, there was this 70 AD scattering where it was desolated. And there'll be a remnant that remembers Yahovah that brings forward. Then he will gather them from 70 AD, he'll gather them back into the land. And we see this with Israel that was reformed in 1948. And then they retook the Temple Mount in 1967. But we also looked at scripture references that there was some type of future scattering. And how did we differentiate that? We found that only half the city was scattered. And then we find that in Zechariah, that there would be some type of future protection in the wilderness that would mimic an Exodus type of scenario. And when we look at our next section, which we're looking at is Revelation 10, and we're looking at the one that comes on the clouds, the cloud rider, that really harkens back to what happened in the wilderness during the Exodus with Israel. And then there will be a future gathering. And we saw that in Matthew 24. And that is the time when Messiah comes back. He gathers his people. He gathers both people. He gathers the whole house of Israel. He gathers Christians that believe in Messiah, and he gathers his Jewish people that have the remnant that's remembered him, the part that only half that got out of the city and that are in the wilderness. And that's something we're going to look at in the future because we're still basically looking at this abomination of desolation. During that study, when we studied all that, we also learned that there was going to be this day of vengeance, that there was also going to be a year of redemption that would then also mimic or mirror this gathering the elect being in the wilderness and that time. Excuse me, I told you I'm just going to be congested. So when we studied and we went back and studied all of these things before the end, when we went back and really studied this persecution, the word persecution and days of vengeance, and we went back and we studied all of that, that's how we determined about this future days of vengeance. So we determined it based on that. Okay. Now, after we had studied all of the time up to 70 AD and studied all the words involved and learned about this expanded view, then we went and we studied the abomination of desolation. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. And we looked at if you look at 70 AD, you just don't see this abomination of desolation picture or type. You see a destruction of Jerusalem, but you don't see this abomination of desolation. And many people want to say, well, destroying the city and destroying the temple was an abomination. No, when we looked at this word abomination, desolation, we get this idea of something that's being put in the temple that is an idol and that it causes a desolation. Yes, Jerusalem was desolated, but they didn't have that abomination, that shakutz, that was the abomination that we saw. And again, I keep saying, go back and look, read watch all the rest of it. So hopefully it makes more sense. All right. So then we put together this timeline where we get the abomination desolation, the great tribulation sign. So all of these things that happened, we put together. We have future scattering, wilderness, and gathering the elect. So hopefully this makes it a little bit more clear. And eventually what we're going all of this related to each of these individual groups of what is happening during these events. So that's the future goal. That's where we're going to go with everything. All right. So again, the future abomination desolation, the 70 AD desolation of Israel right here reflects this Babylonian desolation, um, when Babylon desolated Israel and took them into deportation, where they took them out of the land, they scattered them. So these two mirror each other. These two mirror each other. And then Babylon, remember, it was prophesied that Babylon would be desolated, and that is mirrored here as the nations getting desolated. So we see these things playing out again. Now, we're going to take a look at these four scripture verses in relation to our timeline and our future events timeline. Now, remember when we went to Daniel 12:11. Now, let's take a quick look at Daniel 12:11. And we find that, and from the time the regular burnt offering is removed, and remember we looked at the Hebrew here, and that's one of the things I'm going to have the scholar on next week to see, does my Hebrew translation make sense? Is that an accurate translation? We're going to discuss that. And from the time the regular burnt offering is removed, and to the setting up of the abomination that causes desolation, there will be 1,290 days. So because of that, we get that this sacrifice being removed and the abomination of desolation are separated by 1,290 days. They don't occur at the same time. They're not together. They're separated. So that's the first thing that we add to our timeline. We actually find that something happens prior to that abomination of desolation. And that's based on this translation here, where we went through and we found all the Hebrew words. We put them in actual order in the way the text had it. So this is the way the text of the Hebrew manuscript has it. And you can see, and to setting up abomination and desolation day. So we find that the way that we translate it, in most translations, it's from something, but there's nothing to. But in the original Hebrew, we find that there is a from and a to. From the removal of the burnt offering to the abomination of desolation, there's 1,290 days. So that's how we get that. So that's the next part of building this timeline. And all this timeline is really important. It's all based on, what does 70 AD and tell us? Did these things happen in 70 AD, or are these yet future? That is paramount. Then we go into Daniel 12:12, and we find that there's also 1,335 days, and then there will be a blessing. So the end, the two, is a blessing. We had to ask him to find what was the start point. And it only made sense that the start point was the abomination of desolation. So what we actually get is we get this structure here. That we find that this part after the abomination of desolation is 1,335 days. And so that just made sense with our natural reading order. So now we come back to our overall timeline, and we find that there's 1,290 days from the time that Tamid is taken away, the sacrifice, until the abomination of desolation. Then from the abomination of desolations, there's 1,335 days to the blessing. Well, we still have to define what is that blessing? What is that mean? Does that so we're not going to think that that's somehow days of vengeance, but maybe there's something in the gathering of the elect or the year of redemption that could indicate a blessing. So is that blessing the millennial kingdom? Is that all the way out here? So what is that blessing? And that's something we had to define when we haven't yet really looked at. I have an idea in my mind what the blessing is, but I haven't shown you why I think that is, which we will get into as well. And then also we found that at the abomination of desolation in Daniel 11:31, we found this timeline of things that would happen to this desolate one. So I put that down here on this timeline as well. So we start to get this whole structure starting to be laid out. What that tells us, if the tamid has to be taken away, if the sacrifice has to be taken away, and if there has to be an abomination of desolation set up, that tells us there has to be some type of holy place. Now, the holy place, when we looked at that, that could be just the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting was considered the holy place until the first temple was built. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical temple. It could just be a place where the Israelites think that they're meeting with God, and they say that they're meeting with God. There has to be some type of sacrifice, however. And if you set up a tent of meeting, you could also have the altar on the outside, and you could still have that sacrifice set up. Now, we could also have an actual temple built, so that's still a possibility. They could still do something like that. But until we start to see sacrifices, people want to speculate all the time, but until you see this sacrifice process going on or some type of holy place set up, we just have to be watching and waiting. We just have to be trusting in Jesus, trusting in his return. But it certainly makes it seem much more close. It makes it seem like, hey, maybe there's something really going on here. But it's angst provoking. It makes people a little bit nervous and anxious. We want to know how long. When's this thing going to happen? And I see more and more videos of people saying it's never going to happen. Mostly non-Christians or people that were Christians. I saw this video. I didn't watch all of it. I watched a little bit, but he was a former pastor. He said for 30 years, and he no longer believes any of it. He doesn't believe that Jesus is ever going to return. Is this part of the falling away? So these are the struggles that people have. That we struggle to maintain faith. We struggle to maintain trust in what Yehovah has been doing and when Jesus is going to return. So this is kind of our structure. Then we went on to look at Daniel 9:25 through 27. And when we look at Daniel 9:25 through 27, we found this 70 weeks prophecy. And what we found through that is that there's going to be 7 years or 1 week that's going to be set up, that there's going to be this covenant made. And people had to ask, what is this covenant? Is this covenant Jesus's covenant, or is this the Antichrist covenant? Is this a covenant made with many that's done by the Antichrist? And basically, I came away with two thoughts. One, let's say that this is Antichrist. What that would tell us is that this covenant would go on for 7 years. In the middle of it, the sacrifice is done away with. And then the covenant would end here just before the abomination of desolation, which then allows that person to complete the abomination of desolation. But let's say it's not. Let's say it's not about the Antichrist. Let's say it's about Jesus. Well, then we just get rid of this. Just get rid of all of this. It doesn't do anything for this. It doesn't change this at all because these are based on Daniel 11 and 12. It's not dependent. This covenant is not dependent on these end time scenarios. So really, people put a lot of focus on this 7 week, this 1 week, 7 year covenant, but really it doesn't add much. It really doesn't add much. It just tells us that it gives us another point of where to possibly start something. But you have to ask yourself, okay, well, remember we talked about this. When is that covenant? Is it the covenant that Israel made in 1948? Is it the covenant they made with Jordan in 1967? Is the covenant they made with Egypt in 1979? Which covenant is it? When people keep jumping on these things of this covenant, oh, now it's going to start. Now it's going to start. We don't know. And there's many covenants, there's many agreements that are made. That's why I think that, and ultimately, it's not super helpful. It's not super helpful until we see the sacrifices and something like a temple or a holy place rebuilt. This covenant is meaningless. It's worthless. It's not helpful because ultimately, what Jesus was talking about is this abomination of desolation. And that is dependent upon some type of holy place, is dependent upon some type of sacrifice going on. So we need to be very careful in jumping the gun, in getting people all riled up, because I think it actually shipwrecks the faith of some. Every time somebody comes out with, it's going to happen this year. I watched another video and I had some interaction with some guy says that, these prophets, there's some prophecies from second Ezra's that's going to start in October of this year. And another person says there's something that's starting in February of 2025. It's all speculation. And when these things don't come true, they shipwreck people's faith because people put all this faith in these things. That's why I try to stay with the Bible. What does scripture say that's been handed down to us? And let us be not somebody who is putting our faith in extra biblical works, into timelines that are based upon assumption or based upon um, guesstimates or some type of numerology or all of these different things that people try to work out, these secret codes that they find in the Bible. Yeah, there's some things that really hint to certain time periods, but unless it's explicitly stated, we struggle enough with what's explicitly stated. Why should we bring into the things that are questionable and not completely clear? People, like I said, when we did this Daniel 12:11, people really struggle with these being overlapping. Now, while I think that this covenant with many very well points to a conflict and probably is accurate, I don't think it's ultimately needed. It's not ultimately needed because look where it is. This covenant with many, it's way over here in front of the Tamid. Where did Jesus start talking? Jesus started talking during the abomination of desolation. If he really wanted us to be focused on this covenant and the covenants we should be making, or the Tamid being taken away, he would have mentioned that. He would say, when you see the Tamid taken away of spoken of by Daniel the prophet, when you see the covenant made as spoken by Daniel the prophet, he mentions the abomination of desolation. When you really see that, you could drop the covenant with many and still have a very viable timeline. So, this covenant, while we need to be watchful and waiting, we need to be very careful in what we're saying in terms of getting people, oh, here it comes. Here it comes. We need to be faithful. We need to be people that are praying for other people. We need to be people that are humble, that are loving other people, and that are ones that are following Christ and following God. So, Daniel 9:25 through 27, honestly, I don't think adds much. And remember when I first had first talked about doing it, I talked about doing Daniel 9:25 through 27 for like 4 to 6 weeks. And as I really started praying about it and really working through the scriptures and really contemplating what it means, I came to this that it really doesn't add a lot. Yeah, it's very interesting, but I don't think it really adds anything for our future timeline for this. All right, so already we've covered multiple multiple scriptures. You can see how we can do this timeline pretty quickly. So what we did then is we took that little beautiful timeline here. This is where this structure should fit. There you can see the abomination of desolation right there. So it all starts here and it goes this way. When we do that, we get this type of structure. We get this covenant with many, which very well could be there, might, let's be careful. We get this daily sacrifice being removed, but I also talked about how that could be a starting stopping thing as well. Somebody could stop it and then somebody could restart it again. So this one is not a great one either to say, oh, the sacrifice is stopped. It's all starting. When you see the abomination of desolation, there's only going to be one more abomination of desolation. Somebody's going to stand in the holy place declaring themselves to be God or doing some type of setting up some type of idol. Then you'll get the great tribulation. Then you'll get the sign in the sun, moon, stars. Then you get the Son of Man coming. Then you get this gathering of the elect. And my thought process here is this gathering of the elect is that you get this year of redemption for the Israelites. And during that time, you get this blessing that occurs during that year of redemption. And then there's a year of recompense for that for the nations. We get this year of recompense, and we get a year of redemption in this wilderness time. But this will be somehow 335 days, 1,335 days. So then we went into Daniel 8. So we went into Daniel 8, and we found out that there's 2,300 evenings and mornings, and we took a look at that, and that evenings and mornings is a reference to the sacrifice. How long will it be while the Tamid is gone and the host of heaven is trampled? So the Tamid is taken away, and at the end, the Kodesh, the holy place, is restored. Now, when we look at this, and I haven't talked about this in the main part of the stream, it's very interesting that this is 1,290 days and this is 1,335. This time frame here is based on a calendar that is a 30-day calendar where there's 12 months and there's 30 days, and that means there's 360 days in this calendar. But the extra days are added on based on the cycle of the seasons. So on the spring equinox, the fall equinox, and then at the end of the year, during the spring equinox, when the year starts, they add either 1 or 2 days. But the calendar is based on this. So it's actually short, 5 days. Whereas this calendar, the 2,300 evenings and mornings, is actually a 365-day calendar. That is one that, and then there would be a leap day every few years. Because it's based on sacrifices, and the sacrifices have to go on every day. So if you had a sacrificial calendar for the Tamid, you have to do that every day. This calendar is keeping everything in alignment with and we have to go through this. There's a whole bunch of different studies. Some people think there's a leap week, some people think there's a leap day, but this would have to be looked at. But it's a little bit of a different type of way to view the calendar. And that has implications in when these time frames will play out, and we will get into that. But for now, recognize that there's this time period here that results in the Kodesh, the holy place, being restored, and then this one results in some type of blessing. So I think this calendar makes it a little bit easier to just kind of get an overall picture where it's not all jumbled with everything else that's in there. So I still like to build on this one. All right. So then we put the more the extra stuff in here, right? So now we add in this great tribulation after the abomination. We add in this sign in the sun, moon, stars. add in the Son of Man returning. Add in this gathering of the elect, and this I put this holy place here, but it could be this holy place being restored could be after gathering the elect. I'm not actually certain about that. That's something I'm still working through. So the idea is this holy place that's being restored? Is this the holy place here on earth, or is this the holy place that is in heaven that's being restored? And I'm still grappling with which one that could be. That is a struggle. Um, it's a struggle trying to determine which one that is. I want to say it's probably on Earth, but there's certainly some things because in Daniel 8, the angels are the ones that's asking, and it's also in reference to how long the host is going to be trampled, right? The Kodesh, the Tamid, the sacrifice is taken away for 2,300 days, but the hosts are also being trampled during that time. So when in the holy place is restored, is there something else going on in heaven? And it really suggests that there is. So that's just an area I'm struggling with. So if anybody out there has any thoughts, if you see this, put in the comments. Throw me some of that. That'd be really interesting. And I haven't seen anybody really talk about it. I've tried to look up some different things, and I haven't seen anybody really talk about this Kodesh being restored, because a lot of people think that this 2,300 evenings and mornings is a lot of scholars that report on it think it's related to the Antiochus Epiphanes when the abomination of desolation occurred in 167, and talking about how long it took the Maccabees to restore the temple to its rightful place. That's how it's talked about a lot. So, but I think with when we looked at it, it really suggests that it's something yet future. Okay. So we're actually getting close to being done. I wanted this to be quick. I wanted us to be able to run through this timeline very quickly so people could get a quick overview. And if they really wanted to go in depth, they could really go into more depth by watching the other ones. And I'm actually going to take this and a lot of these extra comments that I'm making, I'm actually going to cut it down even more so that somebody can have this and watch this in a 20 like this, even this commentary that I'm giving right now. It's going to probably be cut out. So somebody can hopefully watch this in 25 minutes and and get a good understanding. Now, clearly people still need to go in and do their own homework. They need to read the scriptures. Uh, but I've given them through there. Okay. So now putting it back on this scale, this timeline, we see our 2,300 evenings and mornings up and through here. We see that our host is trampled down in through here. And then we find that Michael, if we look at Daniel 12:1, we find that Michael is going to rise up at some point. And I think that is related to this host being trampled and Israel and the sacrifice, the Tamid, being taken away. But again, where does that occur? I just put a kind of a general idea, but I don't think we know exactly when these events. Our main focus, our main thing that we need to understand is this. We need to understand the big picture of what's going on so that we can be ready for these certain events that are going to happen. And even more importantly, we need to be ready for how our hearts are going to have. If we're the ones that have to go through this, just like the people that had to go, the apostles that had to go through all those persecutions, like Paul and Peter, and all the apostles that had to go through those things, are we going to be somebody who's ready, much like the apostles were? Are we ready to give our lives for Christ? Are we ready to still love people and not deny the name of Christ? It's going to be a challenge. Okay. So this was our standard interpretation by many people that came that these two events, the Tamid being taken away and the abomination of desolation, were at the same time. So now we had jumped back into Daniel 12:7, and we looked at Daniel 7, chapter 7, where it talks about time, times, and half a time. And so the standard interpretation is this, where all these events overlap, and that the covenant right, with many is here, and that's 42 months. So this whole tribulation time period is about just over 7 years. And again, I don't think that that's accurate. I think that this is much more accurate. That the Daniel 7:25, the time, times, and half a time. Now remember, when we looked at the two references, time, time, and half time, Daniel 7:25 uses that word Adan. It's that Aramaic word that is there's no specific time frame related to it. But we got an idea that it's probably 42 months or 1260 days. And in that such scenario, it could fit into any three of these. And we're going to have to narrow down which one we think it is. But remember, we already know that there is a great tribulation that occurs here. So it seemed like it probably would be here. And Jesus says if that time hadn't been shortened, no life would have survived. So it kind of seems like it would fit here, but it also could kind of fit here. When you see the sacrifice being taken away, maybe that the people are getting persecuted. Maybe Israel is being trampled at that time. So I think that there's some different possibilities here, three different options. But this is related to time, times, and half a time that we see in Daniel 7:25. And we got to Daniel 7:25 because of Daniel 12:7. So in Daniel 12:7, we get this idea where it says that he lifts up his right hand and his left hand, his right hand and his left hand to heaven, and he swears by him who lives forever and ever. And when we look at that, we find that that word time, times, and half time is actually not the same word as we get in Adan, that we get in 7:25, Daniel 7:25. It's actually the word moed. And moed has the idea of appointed times, the times that people are meeting with God. The Hebrew has a regular word for time, et. We had looked at that as well. And that's not the word that's used. So they use the word moed that gives us an idea of an appointed time. And the angel there does something very specific in lifting the hands to heaven. And we see something similar happen very similar when we look at Revelation 10. So then we went and looked at Revelation 10. And Revelation 10 is between the sixth trumpet and the seventh trumpet. And the angel that's coming down, the strong angel that coming down from heaven, lifts his right hand and his left hand and swears by him who lives forever and ever that there is no more time. Doesn't use that there will be a time and a half. He said there was no more time. We find it very interesting. And while I said that I'm after I've looked at everything, I'm convinced that that is Jesus returning. I think it was just kind of that reference is just a small hook to kind of say, look at Revelation. But the rest of the context of Revelation 10 is really what's telling me that this is where Jesus is returning. This trumpets between trumpets 6 and 7. Because it tells us that a strong angels come down from heaven, clothed in a cloud, with a rainbow over his head, with a sun, face like the sun, and feet of pillars of fire. All four of those references are references to the appearance of God in the Old Testament and even a little bit in Revelation. And I'm going to show that. So next week I was going to be doing the beginning of that, but that's probably going to get pushed off a couple more weeks if everything can get arranged with the scholar that I'm working on. I'm not going to mention his name because we haven't finalized everything. So hopefully that'll be the case. So this gives us an idea that hooks this now. This hooks this big timeline into Revelation. And this gives us an idea of how Revelation is going to play out. So now, if we can prove that this is Jesus returning between the sixth trumpet and the seventh trumpet, then that would give us an idea of how that all plays out, which actually marries pretty well because after the seventh trumpet, and when we look at all those things, we find that there should be some type of resurrection going on. And when we talk about this gathering of the elect, we're going to look at the resurrection and we're going to look at the rapture. in relationship to it. So that would also play out. So I think that this is all coming together, and we're going to again we're going to dive into this even more uh, to really flesh this out. But I think if you take just this here, if you take just this structure, it's enough to go and start to put together your own timeline, time frame, and understanding how things are going to play out. But we're going to go into it more. We're going to talk about how the seals, trumpets, and bowls, whether they're linear or they're overlapping. We're going to talk about why, again, the Son of Man is returning here. But that's how, just starting from Matthew 24 and Luke 21, and understanding this abomination of desolation being in the future, how this would all play out. But this is all predicated, this is all based upon, did this abomination of desolation happen in 70 AD, or is it yet future? That is one of the most important questions you can answer. And there's different people that will answer it different ways. And then if it happened in 70 AD, well, what about all the rest of this? What about the Great Tribulation? Where did that happen? Did that happen yet? What about the sign in the sun, moon, and stars? Did that happen? What about Jesus returning? Did that happen yet? So if it happened in the abomination 70 AD, why didn't Jesus return back then? Where was this gathering of the elect? So it becomes very challenging for preterists to make a nice stop without going into what's called full preterism, which is basically saying that Jesus did return in 70 AD. No one's seen him. No one wrote down about it, which pretty much everybody declared as a heresy. For the last 2,000 years, people have said it as a heresy, and there's no evidence that Jesus ever returned. And in fact, up until 70 AD, there's actually scriptures in the New Testament that says anybody that tells you that Jesus has returned is false. They're lying to you. But they say, well, this would happen after Paul wrote this, and it happened in 70 AD. Again, they would say full preterism is a heresy. That is a false teaching. Partial preterism, saying the abomination of desolation occurred in 70 AD. No, as long as they say that Jesus hasn't returned. But why would you say that this happened? And so what are you waiting for? You're waiting for just those individuals are just waiting for Jesus to return. They're just Jesus is going to return at some point. He's just going to pop up. He's just going to come back. Whereas Jesus kind of told us when we look at Matthew 24, and we get here, the gospel of the kingdom proclaimed in the whole inhabited earth for a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see, so then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation, so this whole section here, suggests that the end is coming at this point, and it also points you back into Daniel. So then the preterist, the person who says the abomination, they have to explain what's this 1335 days then? What's this 1290 days that they talked about in Daniel? There's no good explanation for any of that. All these things get shoehorned in and tried to be put into some context. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That is 50 minutes of sliding through, and like I said, I'm gonna try to cut that down. If there's anyone here, I don't know. We'll see if there's anyone here. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, they just want to talk about anything, throw those in chat. Um, yeah, I'll put down any questions. Hopefully this all made sense to everybody. I can go back through in any of the scriptures that people want. I know, I think there's like a 30-second delay on chat. Completely clear to everybody. Okay. Well, it doesn't seem like there's anybody throwing some questions. I'm going to drink some of this water. So let me just talk about what we're seeing right now, because people are always wondering about it. It's challenging what we see in going on in Israel. It's challenging with the war that's going on, um, the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel, um, between the nations that are around Israel. How many of us really are looking for peace? How many of us really want a world of peace? And I think the only real world of peace that we can get is when we have one king, when we all recognize that there is one leader in this world and his word is final. People talk about they want a world of justice and they want a world of peace. But yet many people don't want to listen to the Prince of Peace. They don't want to listen to Jesus. They don't want to listen to what God says because God is also a God of justice. He will judge our actions and he will rebuke people for things that they don't do well. And so it really comes down to, are we willing to be people that are submitting to the word of God? One of the things I like to ask is, if you were in the garden, would you have eaten the fruit? If God says not to eat a fruit, it seems simple. It seems easy. But when God says not to do something, with Christians in this age of grace, we don't have a lot of things that we're not supposed to do. He has a lot of things he wants us to do: love other people, preach the word, preach the gospel. But there are some things he doesn't want us to do. We're not to blaspheme, especially the Holy Spirit. That won't be forgiven. Everything else can be forgiven, but we have to repent. We have to turn away from the things that we were doing. So we say we want this place of peace, this kingdom of peace. We want to go into this millennial temple up here, this millennial kingdom where God rules. But when we read about what might happen, like in Zechariah 14, he talks about if anybody doesn't come up for the Feast of Booths after a year, they won't get rain on them, because one of the requirements is going to be for the nations to come up for the Feast of Booths. And he's going to show and demonstrate that people don't really want to follow God. Do we want to be someone who follows God on an individual basis? Or do we want to push the word of God on people? And that's a challenge, because we see what the good things about what God says and we want other people to follow them, but we won't make a perfect world in this kingdom in this time frame until Jesus is there to be the one who actually says, this is the rule, this is the law, and this is what happens when people don't follow it. And our challenge is to say, we'll follow you even if it doesn't make sense to us. We'll trust you even if it doesn't make sense to us. That's what he's trying to have us understand and gather. Okay, well, there's no other questions down in chat, so I will let everyone go. Only an hour today. Hopefully, it was interesting to everyone and a blessing. And look forward to putting the condensed version. I'll probably just work on it the next hour. Peace, shalom, shalom, and God bless everyone. Boom, boom.